Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a life so bizarre, you'll wonder how the species didn't go extinct out of sheer embarrassment. We're not talking about cavemen throwing spears or painting on cave walls. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to have sex in the Stone Age. The smell, the sounds, the courtship rituals that included grunting, lice grooming, and occasionally throwing a chunk of half-rotten meat at your potential mate's feet as a proposal. If you're enjoying our sleepy history journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or a subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing our sleepy community grow across the world. Now close your eyes, lay back, because tonight you're not just watching history, you're living it. And unfortunately for you, you've just been transported back to a world with no soap, no pants, and absolutely no concept of personal space. You're not a modern human anymore. You're a Paleolithic Homo sapiens, maybe even a Neanderthal, depending on what side of the river you've woken up on. Your eyebrows are heavy, your breath is worse, and your idea of a romantic date involves not dying in front of someone. Here in the upper Paleolithic world, romance is not a word that exists. Neither is the word hygiene. But what does exist is a set of deeply strange, sometimes violent, and occasionally hilarious mating rituals rooted in survival, scent, and whatever your tribe hasn't already eaten. There are no candles, no Barry White, no privacy, no cultural taboos. You live in a communal cave where every bodily function is someone else's lullaby. And while anthropologists have long tried to piece together the prehistoric mating dance, the picture that emerges is equal parts fascinating and absolutely revolting. Sex isn't about pleasure, it's about timing. Because when food is scarce and predators are many, your body becomes a walking fertility clock. Ovulation becomes your most valuable resource, and your scent, which you cannot smell but everyone else can, becomes a neon sign flashing above your head that says, "Now's your best chance." Biologists suggest that scent-driven mating cues may have been just as important as visual ones, if not more. Think musk over makeup. And if you're wondering whether the cave folk were monogamous, the short answer is no. The long answer is absolutely not. The concept of a lifelong partner probably didn't exist when life expectancy hovered around 30. Instead, mating strategies were fluid, often dictated by dominance, resource control and proximity. If you had the fattest mammoth haunch and the driest sleeping spot, congratulations, you were suddenly irresistible. Love was transactional and the currency was calories. But before you get to that point, there's the issue of attraction. What made someone sexy in 30,000 BCE? Spoiler, not teeth. Dental hygiene was, generously speaking, prehistoric. Halitosis was more of a shared cultural experience than a problem. Yet what mattered more was your health, your strength, and your apparent ability to survive. A wide pelvis, strong limbs, and visible muscle mass weren't just attractive, they were literal survival advertisements. And if you're imagining something tender, don't. Prehistoric sex wasn't dimly lit and full of slow-motion breathing. It was awkward, fast, and sometimes witnessed by a small, judgmental goat. There was no bed. You were lucky if there wasn't a sharp rock under your back, and even luckier if the cave bears were hibernating and not watching from the dark. Despite the lack of documentation, cave art gives us a few blurry hints. Some of the oldest known carvings and drawings depict exaggerated fertility symbols, wide hips, swollen breasts, and vulva-shaped figures etched into rock faces. These weren't the ancient world's equivalent of dirty magazines, they were sacred. Fertility was everything. You didn't just mate for fun, you mated for the tribe's survival, which made sexual acts symbolic, ritualistic, and sometimes terrifyingly public. But even without spoken language as we know it, communication still happened. Grunts, postures, grooming rituals, and maybe even rhythmic dancing around the fire served as flirtation. Lice-picking, that was basically second base, sharing marrow from a cracked femur, practically a proposal. Of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. Seasonal shifts, scarcity of food, and environmental stresses deeply influence sexual behaviour. Some researchers believe mating seasons may have existed, timed with nature's abundance. After all, there's no point in conceiving during a famine, and when birth was as dangerous as the hunt itself, timing meant everything. Oh, and about birth. That's something you might want to prepare for, because this story doesn't end with mating. It ends with screaming, blood, and possibly being chewed on by wolves mid-delivery. But that's for later. For now, you're still in the awkward, smelly, extremely public courtship phase. You're figuring out whether the person beside you, who hasn't bathed in a month and is gnawing on a squirrel leg, is giving you a mating glance or just has something in their eye. The truth is, prehistoric sex wasn't romantic. It wasn't elegant. It was functional, strange, deeply biological, and governed by instincts you've long forgotten. But somehow, it worked. Because here you are, thousands of generations later, watching this video in your warm private room, marvelling at the fact that your ancestors somehow managed to reproduce despite absolutely everything working against them. And now that you've been thoroughly introduced to the biology of attraction, it's time to learn what happens when it actually works. When the looks are exchanged, the fire is lit, and the cave gets a little too quiet. The next part? Well, you're going to need to lie very still for it. Your foot itches. That's not unusual. It always itches. So does your scalp, your chest, your lower back, and parts of your anatomy that frankly shouldn't be public property. You don't know it yet, but your body is a 5-star buffet for lice. You are not alone. You are never alone. Your hair houses entire dynasties of parasites who have outlasted ice ages, mammoth migrations, and whatever that suspicious rash is on your inner thigh. But here's the twist. That itchy nuisance crawling through your tangled hair might be your best chance at romance. Because in the Stone Age, grooming wasn't just hygiene, it was foreplay. One of the most intimate acts two prehistoric humans could share was sitting beside each other and gently plucking lice from each other's skin folds. Picking lice was part bonding ritual, part mutual survival pact, and part social glue. Think of it as the Paleolithic version of swiping right, only instead of a match you get a beetle leg under your fingernail, and the act itself, oddly tender, slow, deliberate, soothing in the way only survival rituals can be. Removing lice from someone else's body is a sign of trust. You're exposing your vulnerable neck, your defenseless scalp, your increasingly fragrant armpits to another person who has, statistically speaking, likely seen someone mauled by a bear. If they don't flinch, it's love. Anthropologists call this social grooming, and it's a phenomenon observed across the primate world. Chimpanzees do it. Baboons do it. You, unfortunately, do it. And not just because you're itchy. Social grooming strengthens bonds, reduces stress, and helps create cohesion in small, high-stress groups. In a world without antibiotics or deodorant, your relationships depend not on compliments, but on fingernails and vigilance. Courtship wasn't about witty banter. You didn't seduce with poetry or serenades. You seduced by noticing a flea near the collarbone and doing something about it. This wasn't an act of pity, it was attention. And attention, in prehistoric society, was currency. You wanted someone to care enough to stare at your arm for 30 minutes while pulling off tiny-legged hitchhikers with surgical precision. Because if they do that, they might also keep you warm at night and share their mammoth bones during the lean weeks. Of course, grooming wasn't the only method of flirtation. Body odour played an unfortunate role. You may imagine yourself exuding the pheromones of a rugged survivor, but in reality you smell like a soup made of rotten onions and wet fur. And that's considered attractive. Scent was the most primal mating signal. Modern humans still retain some of that sensitivity, but in the Paleolithic, it was the main event. A healthy, pungent scent meant functioning hormones, fertility, and good nutrition. A scent that was too sweet or metallic might mean infection. In other words, your stink was a medical chart. You don't bathe, no one bathes. Water is for drinking or falling into. But your scent evolves daily based on what you eat, how stressed you are, and what parasites have made you their temporary god. This ever-changing bouquet becomes part of your dating profile. Your tribe's noses are highly trained, and whether they admit it or not, they are constantly sniffing. There is also posture. You learn early that slouching signals weakness, that wide stances and upright chests are not just comfortable, they are declarations. Your tribe may not speak in full sentences, but body language is an intricate lexicon of courtship and dominance. A certain tilt of the head might indicate interest. A prolonged eye squint might mean curiosity, or a need for fire, or possibly gas. The meanings are flexible. Dancing appears at some point. Maybe it's rhythmic stomping near a fire. Maybe it's a chaotic leap into the air while waving a burnt stick. But movement becomes part of the language. Your ancestors learned to read the way another human moved and assign meaning to it. A confident dance meant health and high spirits. A confused wiggle could mean neurological damage. You had to learn quickly. And then there are gifts. The first recorded love tokens were not flowers or poetry, but chunks of food. Sharing meat, especially rare or fatty cuts, was considered an act of deep interest. If someone gave you a bone with marrow still in it, they might as well be saying, "I see a future with you," assuming wolves don't eat us first. These offerings were not always accepted. Sometimes they were thrown back with a grunt that roughly translates to "you are beneath me," which might also mean literally, depending on where you were standing. One of the strangest courtship tactics involves risk. Some researchers suggest that early humans may have engaged in displays of physical danger to signal their desirability. Climbing high cliffs, wrestling animals, or sticking hands into nests of angry bees were not acts of insanity. They were ways of saying, "I'm brave enough to die for a slightly better gene pool," and surprisingly, it worked. Nothing says potential mate like a limping fool carrying a honeycomb and several new puncture wounds. Now, of course, these behaviours weren't universal. The world of early humans spanned continents, climates, and cultures. While some tribes may have had more elaborate rituals, others may have relied on proximity and mutual tolerance. But the themes remain oddly consistent. Touch, scent, shared resources, and a capacity for survival under pressure were the building blocks of affection. Love was less about butterflies in the stomach, and more about intestinal parasites and firewood. There were no songs, no eye contact held just a little too long, no whispered declarations. There was only lice, shared meals, a scratch behind the ear, and maybe a bloody rabbit hide tossed your way with ambiguous enthusiasm. So the next time you wonder how your ancestors managed to pass down their genes without poetry or lingerie, remember this. They flirted with grooming fingers, with rank odour, with half-chewed squirrel legs and aggressive staring. They courted each other in caves lit by burning dung and serenaded each other with snorts and coughs. And somehow, through all that, they found connection. Temporary, awkward, and probably chafing, but connection nonetheless. Of course, once the grooming was done and the smell deemed acceptable, there was the matter of performance. And unfortunately, for many of your ancestors, it involved a lot of confusion, poor technique, and wildly inconsistent anatomy. And you're about to find out exactly what that means, because flirting is only half the battle. The rest is an evolutionary gamble of primal instincts and deeply questionable pelvic strategies. Brace yourself. You're on the ground, not by choice. That is simply where things happen. Grass, dirt, sticks, and whatever animal waste hasn't yet decomposed. This is your love nest. There is no mattress, no cushion, no strategically fluffed pillow to cradle your head, while a pan flute plays softly in the background. What you have instead is the sharp reality of Stone Age intimacy. and it is about to get experimental. Sex in prehistory was not choreographed. It was not instructional. It was not romantic. It was mostly chaotic. You do not know where your limb should go. You do not know where your partner's limbs are going. And you have no idea whether what you're doing is productive or simply undignified flailing. Because there is no Kama Sutra, no internet forum, no stone-carved how-to guide with tasteful diagrams. There is only trial, error, and an overwhelming number of thorns. Anthropologists, for all their digging and theorizing, are still not entirely sure what positions were most common among prehistoric humans. What we do know is that anatomy does not change much in 50,000 years. The same hips, joints, and awkward knee angles that apply today applied then. What changes is knowledge, comfort, and the complete absence of expectations. You're not aiming for style. You're aiming for functionality, preferably without injury. The most likely default was whatever position required the least coordination and the fewest exposed organs. Missionary might sound biblical, but it is also logical. It requires nothing but frontal contact, which has the added benefit of increasing the chance for eye contact, facial recognition, and possibly a polite grunt. But squatting and rear entry were also viable, especially in cultures that associated face-to-face mating with intimacy or risk. Some early societies may have even favoured positions based on fertility myths or spiritual beliefs. And yes, even without writing, belief systems existed. Fertility symbols appear in cave art all over Europe and Asia. The Venus figurines, with their exaggerated breasts, hips, and reproductive features, are believed to represent fertility, abundance, and possibly erotic ideals. They may have served as visual aids, totems, or inspiration. Or they may have just been oddly shaped toys carved during particularly boring winters. The truth is unknowable, but their existence confirms one thing. Prehistoric people thought about sex constantly, just like you. Now back to the logistics. Pelvic alignment was a problem. The pelvis, contrary to popular belief, is not a perfect hinge. Early humans had to adapt their approach based on hip width, flexibility, and terrain. Mud makes certain things slippery. Ice makes others nearly fatal. And uneven ground has introduced more accidental head trauma into courtship than any modern dating app. If you were lucky enough to mate indoors, which usually meant inside a communal cave or animal hide shelter, you still face challenges like low ceilings, curious onlookers, and the persistent smell of fermented yak milk. Communication was another obstacle. Without language, you relied on touch and gesture. There was no asking for permission in polite tones. Consent was likely expressed through body cues, willingness shown by posture, resistance shown by retreat or defensive behaviour. It was a messy system with a high margin of error, but it was the best anyone could manage without vowels. And then there was duration. Let us be honest. No one in this era was lasting long. High stress, poor nutrition, and an ever-present risk of being trampled by a boar meant that mating was brief and instinctive. It was not about prolonged enjoyment. It was about reproduction before frostbite. The average encounter probably lasted less time than it takes to rub two sticks together, and that was considered a success. Privacy was non-existent. If you were hoping for some alone time, you were sorely out of luck. Your tribe lived in close quarters. Your children slept nearby. So did your elders. So did the shaman. So did the dog. And while everyone pretended not to notice what was happening behind the animal hide curtain or around the fire's edge, they noticed. There was simply nowhere else to go. If you wanted privacy, you went into the woods, and then hoped the wolves weren't in the mood for something more exciting than a rabbit. Interestingly, the brain chemistry of early sex was not all that different from yours. Dopamine, oxytocin, and a rush of adrenaline still played their part. These chemicals, deeply rooted in mammalian biology, helped foster bonds and reinforce mating behaviour. They made you feel good enough to do it again, even if you threw out your back the first time and got a tick lodged in a crevice you cannot reach. There are even theories that rhythmic mating behaviours contributed to the evolution of music and dance. Some anthropologists suggest that early sexual activity, with its repetitive movements and grunted vocalizations, may have influenced early percussion rhythms. If that sounds absurd, consider this. The oldest known musical instrument is a flute made from a vulture bone, dated to around 40,000 years ago. It was found in a cave system that also featured female figurines and phallic carvings. You do the math. Prehistoric humans also dealt with an array of anatomical challenges. Hair got in the way, bones cracked, infections spread quickly. Genital injuries, though rarely documented, were almost certainly common. Without antibiotics or antiseptics, even a small abrasion could become a life-threatening abscess. Yet despite all this, the species thrived. That means someone figured it out. Many someones. Often. Possibly with regret, but with results. And those results eventually led to the development of basic sexual customs, ritualized courtship, symbolic gestures, the gradual glacial evolution of rules. What began as fumbling biology became culture. You would not recognize it as such. But even in the chaos of prehistoric coupling, the seeds of future etiquette were being planted. There was already such a thing as preferred partners, already a concept of exclusivity, even if it was temporary, already an understanding that who you mated with could influence your social standing, your access to food, and your survival odds. This wasn't love as you know it, but it was attachment, affection, maybe even companionship, formed in the aftermath of confusion, mutual scratching, and shared embarrassment. Which, to be fair, is not all that different from how some modern relationships begin. And just when you think you're starting to understand how prehistoric people navigated sex, something even more complicated arrives: pregnancy. Because even in the Stone Age, actions had consequences, and those consequences arrived swollen, screaming, and covered in cave dirt. So prepare yourself. Your pelvic experiment has worked, the ritual has been completed, and now your prehistoric partner is starting to bloat in a way that suggests you will soon be very, very tired. Your feet hurt. Your back is screaming. You have not had a proper bowel movement in days, and your stomach is doing something strange. Not food poisoning strange. Not mammoth fat too long in the sun strange. Something deeper. Something lurching and cellular, and completely beyond your control. You are pregnant, and nothing is sterile. Not the water, not the tools, not the fingers that will eventually assist in whatever exit strategy your body is planning. Gestation in the Paleolithic was not a private affair. The whole tribe knew before you did. They saw your energy drop, your appetite rise, your skin swell with the hormonal glow of primal inconvenience. There was no pregnancy test, no pink line, no ultrasound. There was only communal judgment, unsolicited advice, and a lot of sympathetic grunting from other women who had already survived it. Barely. You were now considered a sacred vessel, but sacred did not mean pampered. It meant observed. It meant your every movement was now a matter of tribal concern. Were you sleeping enough? Were you eating enough? Were you about to fall into the fire again because your balance had suddenly evaporated? The moment life began growing inside you, your autonomy was replaced with 1,000 anxious eyes, tracking your every step, breath, and sneeze. And if you thought modern pregnancy was uncomfortable, try it with no shoes, no chairs, and an almost constant threat of being stepped on by something with tusks. Your body was under siege. Morning sickness arrived with the same vengeance it has always had. You vomited into leaves. You vomited into holes. You vomited into your own hands more than once because the tribe had not yet invented timing. The hormonal roller coaster had begun. Estrogen and progesterone surged, swelling your breasts, softening your joints, and occasionally making you cry over the shape of rocks. Cortisol flared under stress, which was constant. Because your body understood something your brain refused to acknowledge. Childbirth in this age was a gamble, not a miracle, a 50-50 shot at best. And those odds only improved if you had survived a previous birth without infection, hemorrhage, or being eaten mid-labour. You were now consuming more calories than anyone else in the tribe, except the men who thought they were warriors and mostly just sat near the fire grunting. You craved protein, you dreamed of marrow, you licked stones for minerals and sniffed dirt to detect iron. This was not madness, this was biology. Pica, the craving for non-food substances, has been recorded in humans for tens of thousands of years. Pregnant bodies know what they need, even if what they need is apparently the corner of a clay wall. And food safety was not a concept. Nothing was pasteurized. Everything was either too raw, too burnt, or already claimed by insects. You were told to eat anyway. Because famine was always waiting. The developing fetus was not a priority in a nutritional sense. Your survival was the first concern. If you lived, maybe the baby would too. But if you starved, the baby was a footnote, a loss, a shadow in the smoke. Despite the chaos, your body adapted, slowly, painfully, but with ancient efficiency. Your pelvic joints loosened thanks to relaxin, the hormone that prepares you for the absurd task of squeezing a human through a passage designed more for waste than miracles. Your blood volume doubled. Your skin stretched in directions that defied your understanding of skin, and you grew something called a mucus plug, which no one will explain to you, but everyone in the elder circle seems very concerned about. There was no prenatal care. There was no prenatal anything. If you were lucky, one of the older women in your tribe had assisted in previous births and remembered which herbs helped with swelling and which ones accidentally stopped your heart. Ethnobotany, the study of plant medicine, likely began with trial and error. Lots of error. But humans were learning, slowly, painfully, by rubbing roots on rashes and counting how many people died afterward. Social roles shifted during pregnancy. You were no longer expected to hunt or carry heavy loads. You were expected to rest. But rest did not mean leisure. It meant gathering lighter things, keeping the fire going, listening to everyone else's drama while pretending not to vomit again. You were still part of the machinery, just less mobile, and considerably more terrifying when angry. And the swelling. Oh, the swelling. Your ankles disappeared, your bladder became a trampoline. You could not sleep on your back without the weight of your uterus pressing into your spine like a sack of aggressive potatoes. You snored louder, you sweat more, you cried during rainstorms for no reason other than the clouds looked a bit judgmental. Even the tribe's belief systems became tangled in your condition. Some saw you as blessed. Others believed your cravings and mood swings meant you were temporarily possessed by spirits. This was not an insult. Spirits were part of everyday life. They explained illness, weather, and the behaviour of that one cousin who kept stealing fish and blaming wolves. You were spiritual territory now, and you were treated with a mix of reverence and caution, like a volcano that occasionally bakes bread. There were no gender reveal parties, no baby showers, but there were rituals, carvings, songs, stones placed in patterns to protect the unborn. Some Paleolithic cultures may have believed in soul migration, the idea that spirits entered the womb during certain moon phases. Others believed the fetus was a miniature adult curled in the dark waiting for its cue. Biology and mythology coexisted, and neither had the decency to explain themselves. As you reached the third trimester, you became heavier than your own legs could support. You waddled, you groaned, you slept sitting up, and everyone gave you more space near the fire, not out of kindness, but because they were slightly afraid of you now. You were creation wrapped in sweat and fury. You were nature's gamble on two legs, and your time was coming. Labour was unpredictable. It could last minutes, it could last days, and there was no guarantee of who would survive it. The position varied from tribe to tribe. Some women squatted, Others knelt. Some hung from tree branches. It was a primal chaos of pushing, screaming and praying that whoever was catching had trimmed their fingernails recently. There were no sterile gloves, no clamps, no epidurals, just hands. Rough, warm, practiced hands, and pain. Endless, indescribable pain. The kind of pain that reshapes your memory, that rewires your understanding of your body, that leaves you screaming until your voice is gone and then still screaming anyway. And then, if you were lucky, there was life. A wet, wailing, uncoordinated miracle, covered in fluid, squinting at the firelight, screaming into the void it had just entered. The entire tribe leaned forward, listening, watching, hoping for the cry that meant lungs were working and the gods for once were looking the other way. And if that cry did not come, there was only silence, followed by grief, which was common, which was normal, which was never spoken of again. But if it did come, and if you lived long enough to hold your baby upright and squint at its wrinkled face, you were changed. Not just biologically, but socially. You were a mother now, a figure of importance, a vessel proven worthy, and your journey, somehow, was only just beginning. Because in the next breath, someone hands you a chewed piece of meat and says, "Congratulations. You're ready to feed another life with your own body. You're now a cave woman with a newborn, and sleep, that ancient luxury, has just been taken off the menu. Your baby is attached to your body like a barnacle. It cries when you stop walking. It cries when you start walking. It cries when the wind changes direction, or when a pine cone falls too loudly in the distance. It is your new shadow, and it smells like sour milk, old spit, and unfiltered life. You're now a food source, not metaphorically, literally. Your breasts are the only thing between this child and death, and they know it. The whole tribe knows it. Even the wolves circling in the woods seem aware that you're now producing something valuable for once. Breastfeeding in the Paleolithic was not a lifestyle choice. It was not something you blogged about or debated in the cave parenting group. It was a biological necessity. Formula did not exist. Cow's milk was still inside a cow and not easily negotiated. Wet nurses may have existed in some form within larger groups, but only if a woman had recently given birth herself and was feeling generous, which was rare when everyone was one bad berry away from a full gastrointestinal collapse. Colostrum, the thick yellowish milk that arrives in the first days after birth, came in just as it does now. Packed with antibodies, immune cells, and nutrients, it was the baby's first and possibly only line of defense against the bacterial circus that was your environment. You may not know what colostrum is, but your body does. It produces it without your permission and delivers it to a child that cannot see more than 6 inches in front of its face, but can find a nipple like a heat-seeking missile. There were no nursing pillows, no lactation consultants, no lanolin creams. You breastfed while squatting, while walking, while cooking, while running from things. You breastfed in front of the entire tribe because there was no other option, and modesty was not yet invented. Your breasts were public infrastructure. If you tried to cover them, people would have assumed you were hiding berries or a small wounded rodent. Your diet affected your milk. If you ate well, your milk was thick and nourishing. If you starved, your milk thinned, your energy dropped, and your baby screamed harder. Malnutrition was common. A breastfeeding mother needed more calories than a hunter and often got fewer. Your body began to cannibalize itself to keep the milk flowing. Fat reserves melted, bone density dropped, your joints ached. But still, you fed the baby, because there was no other choice. And it hurt. Of course it hurt. The baby latched poorly. Sometimes they had tongue ties or mouth sores. Sometimes your nipples cracked or bled or scabbed. Infections like mastitis likely occurred, though no one called it that. They just said you had the fire chest and rubbed bark sap on you while hoping you did not die. Because if you died, the baby would almost certainly follow. Infant mortality rates in prehistoric societies were catastrophic. By some estimates, nearly half of children died before age 5. Infection, dehydration, accidents, or simply being born in the wrong season could doom a newborn. But for those who survived, breastfeeding was often prolonged. Unlike modern societies where early weaning is possible, prehistoric babies often nursed for years, some until the age of 3 or 4. This was not sentimentality, it was strategy. Breast milk was safer than water, more nourishing than scavenged scraps. It came with built-in antibodies and was always at the right temperature. Your child clung to you through sickness, cold nights, and moments of terror because your body was both shelter and kitchen. There were no pacifiers, no bottles. The act of breastfeeding was constant, instinctual, and disruptive. Your sleep came in minutes, not hours. You fed the baby before bed, during bed, and after someone stepped on a branch and woke the entire cave. There was no such thing as sleep training. Babies who cried were not ignored. They were shushed and bounced and rocked with the desperate motion of someone trying to avoid both hypothermia and a saber-tooth surprise. Breastfeeding also impacted fertility. The longer you nursed, the more likely your body would delay ovulation. This natural form of birth spacing, known as lactational amenorrhea, was one of the few tools prehistoric women had to prevent rapid, successive pregnancies. It was not reliable, but it was better than nothing, especially when nothing included the risk of hemorrhage, starvation, and another 9 months of vomiting into the communal soup bowl. Your breasts changed. They were never the same again. Sagging was not a cosmetic concern. It was a badge of survival. You could often tell how many children a woman had by the trajectory of her chest. Elders spoke with reverence of breasts that had fed 5 or 6 children and still functioned in the cold. Breasts were not ornamental. They were utilitarian. They were celebrated for endurance, not aesthetics. And then there were the parasites, because of course there were. Fleas, mites and lice loved the warm folds of nursing skin. You were never alone. You were never clean. Your baby sometimes latched onto a nipple that had been groomed by a beetle an hour earlier. Everyone survived it somehow. The immune system adapted, or gave up, or just learned to tolerate more nonsense than modern biology would permit. Socially, breastfeeding cemented your place in the tribe. You were now part of the maternal hierarchy. You might receive slightly better scraps of meat, slightly softer bedding, slightly more patience when you screamed into the night from exhaustion. Other women helped you when they could. The tribal aunties would take the baby for minutes at a time, just long enough for you to pee behind a tree or eat a handful of boiled moss without interruption. Fathers sometimes helped. Occasionally, if they were nearby. If they were not hunting or boasting or pretending to be asleep. Sometimes they brought food. Sometimes they brought lice. Mostly they just hovered nearby looking uncomfortable while the baby fed noisily, and everyone pretended that this was not completely absurd. You learned to do everything one-handed. You carved tools while holding a baby, you sorted roots, you defended yourself, you wiped other children's noses, you kept the fire alive, all while a small human dangled from you like a determined toothless badger. And eventually the baby grew. They nursed less. They learned to chew, to bite, to take food from the communal pile without needing you every 3 seconds. Your breasts became less swollen, less sore, slightly more your own again. And then, just as you began to feel human, something inside you twinged. Something familiar. Something hormonal. Because in this age, fertility did not take breaks. You were not finished. Your body was ready again, and the tribe had noticed. You had barely finished feeding one life before another was waiting to begin. You have survived. Somehow. Against the odds, against the infections, against the weather, and against the sheer irrationality of trying to push something the size of a wild turnip through a hole that previously only hosted monthly blood sacrifices. Your baby is alive. You are alive. And the cave does not applaud. It just keeps being cold and loud and full of other people's feet. Now comes the part no one warned you about. The part that is less sacred miracle and more biological betrayal. Postpartum. Your body's leaking from several areas, none of them in ways that inspire tribal songs. You're sore. You're raw. You're emotionally unstable in the way only someone who has just watched their internal organs audition for escape can be. And no one brings you soup. There is no maternity leave. There is no leave of any kind. The only thing that has left is your pelvic stability and your sense of dignity. In the Paleolithic world, postpartum recovery was not a structured process. It was an improvisation, a clumsy dance of instincts and environmental hazards. You bled. Of course you bled. The lochia, a postpartum discharge of blood, mucus and uterine tissue, could last for weeks. There were no pads, no towels, just moss, dried animal hide, grass, whatever was not already being used by someone else. It was not effective, but it was something, and that was enough. Your uterus contracted painfully as it shrank back to its usual size. This was helpful. It was also terrible. Without painkillers, you had to settle for biting sticks and pretending to enjoy whatever roots the medicine woman handed you. Some herbs may have helped. Others made you hallucinate. A few may have just been early attempts at getting you to shut up. You were expected to move, slowly, carefully, but still move. Staying still too long was suspicious. You might be sick. You might be cursed. You might be wasting food. So you limped around the fire, half-dressed, fully leaking, trying to maintain a normal expression, while one of your hips made a clicking noise that felt like the ghost of childbirth haunting your bones. The other women watched you, judged you, not cruelly, but out of curiosity. Were you strong? Were you weak? Were you going to survive and join the ranks of respected mothers, or fade like the ones who never quite recovered? Status in the tribe shifted with reproduction. To give birth and endure was to climb the ladder, but not too quickly, not too proudly. No one liked arrogance, especially from someone who still smelled like blood and despair. The baby stayed attached to you. You shared body heat. You shared breath. Sometimes you shared meals in the sense that they spat your chewed food back into your face. That was normal. Pre-mastication, the practice of chewing food before transferring it to an infant, was common across early societies. It was disgusting, but it worked. There were no blenders, no baby spoons, just teeth and hope and whatever animal fat was not yet rancid. Your relationship with the other mothers became more complicated. You were no longer just one of them. You were newly initiated. They tested you, gave advice, sometimes nonsense, sometimes helpful, often contradictory. Do not feed the baby during storms. Only bathe it in moonlight. Bury the placenta near the eastern tree. No one knew why, but everyone was very sure about it. The placenta itself had a brief moment of fame. In some early cultures it was considered sacred, buried with ritual, burned with prayers, or simply eaten by the mother for supposed strength and spiritual reconnection. You did not eat yours, mostly because the wolves were circling and got to it first. This too was considered an omen. Whether good or bad depended on who you asked. Sex was no longer expected of you. For a time, but not forever. Once you stopped bleeding, the tribe remembered that you were technically functional again, which meant you were back on the social menu. Your mate, if you had one, began hovering, not with affection, but with curiosity, like someone inspecting a campfire that recently exploded but might be usable again. You were not ready. Your hormones were still on a Viking-style raid through your body. Oxytocin surged and dropped like a violent tide. Prolactin kept your milk flowing but made your emotions unpredictable. You cried at firelight, at the smell of pine, at your own hand. Your partner and most of the men in the tribe responded with respectful fear, the kind that comes from realizing you are living with someone who has created life and will destroy yours if you get between them and sleep. Speaking of sleep, you did not get any. The baby woke constantly, cried constantly, needed food, warmth, noise, silence, motion, and stillness in alternating and contradictory intervals. Your rest came in seconds. You began to hallucinate. Once you were sure the fire was whispering your name. Once you mistook a rabbit for your grandmother. You had never met your grandmother. Your body changed again. Your belly softened. Your hair thinned. Your joints ached. Your feet flattened. Your hormones restructured your metabolism, your immune response, and your mental stability. And through it all, you smiled when people looked at you. Because a smile meant you were surviving, and surviving meant you were worthy of keeping resources. There were no mirrors. You saw yourself only in puddles, in the eyes of others. You began to forget what you looked like before, not that it mattered. Your identity had shifted. You were not just you. You were the baby's shelter, the tribe's future, a walking milk sack with opinions and sore knees. And through all of it, the politics of postpartum unfolded around you. Some mothers bonded together, shared food, carried each other's children. Others competed silently, for attention, for influence, for a place near the fire where the wind did not reach. You learned to navigate it, to nod in the right moments, to grunt with agreement when another mother claimed her child had already spoken to the forest spirits. Spirituality and superstition intertwined with postpartum life. Some believed that mothers glowed because they were touched by the spirit world. Others believed that failing to recover quickly meant you were haunted. Illness, depression, lethargy, and anxiety were rarely treated. They were observed, tolerated, sometimes mocked. If you stared into the fire too long, someone might quietly ask the shaman if you'd been hexed, but most simply left you to it. You recovered because you had to. You got stronger because weakness meant death. And when you finally stood straight again, when the bleeding stopped and your joints stopped weeping, you were someone new, someone respected, not for beauty, not for charm, but for endurance. And as you re-entered the rhythm of the tribe, there was a quiet understanding. You had made it. You had returned from the brink, and now you were part of the lineage. Another cave mother among the thousands stretching back through time, each one leaking, limping, and laughing at the absurdity of it all. Of course, the peace does not last, because nothing peaceful ever does in this timeline. The baby will soon start crawling, then walking, then asking questions with its face, and then you will have to explain what mating is and why the cave next door sounds like a drum circle hosted by animals in pain. Because sex education in the Stone Age did not come with books. It came with observation, with mistakes, and with you trying very hard to explain how not to be eaten by a bear during courtship. The child is staring, not at the fire, not at the woolly rodent chewing a bone in the corner, not even at the suspicious puddle forming under the meat-drying rack. Number. The child is staring at you. Or more accurately, at two people nearby attempting to repopulate the tribe behind what can only be described as a curtain made from squirrel pelts. It does nothing. The sounds are clear. The movements are educational. The trauma is permanent. This is how you learned. This is how everyone learned. In the Paleolithic world, there was no formal curriculum, no leaf-bound handbook explaining biology, no cave etchings labelled with tidy arrows and captions. There was no privacy and therefore no mystery. Sex was not a lesson. It was a background event. As normal as a sneeze, as common as dirt, as loud as mammoth mating season. Children grew up surrounded by it, in tight-knit groups where space was shared, where sleeping areas overlapped with cooking areas, where daily life meant witnessing things too complicated to understand and too frequent to ignore. You saw it. You heard it. You learned from observation, and you made a lot of incorrect guesses along the way. No one sat you down to explain reproduction. There was no awkward tribal talk by the fire. Instead, you noticed patterns. Someone grunted with another person, then they shared food, then months later someone swelled up, then they screamed, then a baby came out. You connected the dots as best you could, usually with 1 or 2 dots missing. Most children believed babies came from bellies because the gods were pleased or because someone fell asleep too close to the fire with their legs crossed. The truth was hazy, but the consequences were clear. Imitation was inevitable. Children mimicked everything: speech patterns, walking styles, tool use, and yes, mating behavior. Sometimes this led to innocent confusion. Sometimes it led to the kind of incidents that caused elders to grunt with alarm and forcibly redirect everyone toward berry gathering. Early societies had to manage this with equal parts tolerance and intervention, because everyone knew where it led. The future depended on reproduction, but the timing of it still mattered. Too young and the body could break, too late and the tribe might not grow. So the signs of puberty were watched closely. You knew you were maturing when your sweat changed, when your hips widened, when your voice cracked or your hair thickened. These were biological signals, not just for you, but for everyone around you. There were no birthdays. You marked age by scars, stretch marks, and the day you stopped getting handed the smallest fish at dinner. When your scent began to shift, the tribe shifted with you. Coming of age was not a celebration. It was a transition. A slow, messy migration from nuisance to resource. Some cultures may have had rituals, a first hunt, a solo night in the woods, a decorative scar. Others simply noticed when you stopped tripping over your own feet and started asking questions with too much interest. That was when the knowing looks began. The quiet glances, the sudden offers to help carry meat beside someone with excellent muscle definition. Still, there were no real answers, no conversations. You learned by implication. You learned by implication, and by watching the older members of the group navigate mating with a mix of confidence, confusion, and poorly timed backspasms. You learned that mating was necessary. You also learned that it looked exhausting and occasionally involved someone apologizing to a tree. Some of what you learned was false. For example, you believed at one point that eating certain berries could make you pregnant, or that stepping over a sleeping elder would curse your future children, or that the spirits of your ancestors watched every mating encounter and judged your posture. These beliefs were not entirely discouraged. They provided structure, mystery, sometimes even caution. Fear can be useful when you have no antibiotics. Anthropologists call this informal transmission of knowledge cultural modelling. It is how early humans passed on skills and survival strategies without formal language or structure. It worked. But it was imprecise, which explains a lot about the trial and error approach most early teens took when attempting anything resembling courtship. Your first attempts were awkward. Of course they were. You mimicked what you saw without fully understanding the why. You offered gifts. You tried to dance. You fell into a river. You blamed a frog, and someone may have laughed. But eventually someone did not laugh. Someone returned the glance, shared their food, groomed your lice. And then the real confusion began. Even at that point, the practical details were sketchy. No one explained fertility cycles. No one discussed protection. The concept of unwanted pregnancy was not a medical concern. It was a logistical one. You got pregnant when the spirits allowed it, or when you were unlucky, or when you forgot to avoid that one time of the moon that made your belly feel warm and your teeth itch. Your tribe may have had herbal knowledge to prevent or terminate pregnancies, but access to those plants was often controlled by elders, by tradition, by fear, and gender roles in sex education were uneven. Young men learned from each other, often with the worst possible advice: boasting, guesswork, encouragement from peers who had no idea what they were talking about. Young women, on the other hand, learned through proximity, through observation, through whispered warnings from their mothers and aunts. They were told how to avoid injury, how to avoid certain men, how to sit near the fire and look uninterested even when their hormones said otherwise. Even with limited understanding, some cultural standards emerged. The idea of age-appropriate mating, the importance of mutual interest, the concept of shame, often tied to superstition and spiritual beliefs. You knew that sex mattered. You just were not sure how, or why, or what to do when someone bit your shoulder and called it romantic. This murky watch-and-learn method was the foundation for sexual norms across early human history. It was flawed, it was dangerous, it was riddled with misinformation, but it was also adaptive. Each generation learned slightly more, slightly earlier, slightly better, or at least they got faster at hiding it from the elders. Eventually you figured it out. You had to. Biology insisted. But knowledge always lagged behind instinct, and for most of your life, you operated in that in-between space, understanding the mechanics, but never the meaning. Knowing what to do, but not what it cost, until the cost came in the form of a pregnancy, a bond, a wound, or something worse. And when it did, you became the one others watched. The new children stared at you, heard the noises, saw the rituals, learned from the awkward expressions on your face, and the cycle continued. Because the Stone Age did not educate. It witnessed, it guessed, it hoped for the best while preparing for frostbite and wolves. And just as you begin to think you understand the system, something else arrives to ruin your illusion of control. Someone in the tribe has more than one partner, openly, repeatedly, and no one stops them. Because prehistoric monogamy was a lot more flexible than you expected, and the politics of who mates with whom just got a lot more complicated. You notice something strange. Two people who mated yesterday are now grooming entirely different partners. No one seems shocked. No one is crying into their fire-roasted beetle. In fact, the whole tribe looks unconcerned. You, however, are spiraling, because everything you thought you understood about relationships just evaporated with one exchanged glance and a shared squirrel thigh. Welcome to the prehistoric dating scene, a landscape where exclusivity was a suggestion, where love triangles were more like love-webbed feet, and where jealousy was not private or poetic but communal and loud, and usually involved someone throwing a rock in the general direction of someone else's sleeping mat. Monogamy, in the strict, modern, one-person forever sense, was not the default in the Stone Age. It was not even expected. It was one possible arrangement among many. Early human societies were shaped by survival, mobility, fertility, and group cohesion. If monogamy served those needs, it happened. If it did not, it didn't. The rules were made up, and the points were largely nutritional. Anthropologists have long debated the mating systems of early Homo sapiens and their close cousins. Were they monogamous like some birds, or serially monogamous like most humans today, or promiscuous like bonobos who treat intimacy like a handshake? The evidence suggests it varied, drastically. Some hunter-gatherer groups favoured pair bonding, others practiced flexible partnering, and many simply defaulted to the nearest available and reasonably hygienic human who was not currently vomiting. Resources played a big role. If one person had a reliable source of food, or made excellent tools, or smelled slightly less offensive than average, they were more desirable, but that did not mean they were hoarded. In some tribes, sharing a mate was part of maintaining peace. Avoiding jealousy sometimes meant ignoring it completely. If someone wandered off to another bedding area, you might grunt disapprovingly, but not start a fistfight. mostly because the last fistfight over a mate ended with both suitors trampled by an irritable boar. Child-rearing often influenced partnership structures. In many groups, multiple adults took part in caring for children, regardless of direct biological connection. Anthropologists call this cooperative breeding. It meant that uncles, aunts, grandparents, and even non-relatives contributed to raising young. Because survival was a team sport, not a romantic subplot. And identifying exact parentage was occasionally a matter of educated guessing, and whoever had the least lice at the time, paternity uncertainty shaped behaviour. Without genetic tests or calendars, no one could be fully sure who fathered whom. This led to behaviours that minimised conflict. If everyone assumed a child might be theirs, everyone had a reason to protect it. It sounds absurd. It was also brilliant. It reduced infighting and helped stabilise groups who otherwise would have been busy clubbing each other with femurs. Of course, humans are still humans. Emotional bonds still formed. Jealousy still flared. A favoured partner choosing someone else still stung. But these reactions had to be managed within the tribe's expectations. Expressing possessiveness too forcefully could backfire. You might be seen as unstable, as a threat to group harmony, as the person most likely to get their meat ration quietly shrunk the next day. That didn't mean there were no long-term bonds. Many pairs mated and stayed together for years. They raised children, shared responsibilities, and defended each other from predators and particularly rude neighbours. But even these bonds were not guaranteed. If someone stopped pulling their weight, lost fertility, or simply became a worse storyteller, they could be replaced or supplemented. Mating was fluid, and no one used the phrase cheating because no one invented cheating yet. Just very aggressive eye contact. Even within tribes, status played a role. Higher status individuals often had more access to mates. More meat meant more interest. More shelter meant more company. If you controlled resources, you controlled options. And if you lacked them, you had to rely on personality, which in this case mostly meant not smelling like foot fungus and knowing how to make fire without causing a landslide. Rituals around mating existed, but they varied widely. Some involved symbols of fertility, others involved ceremonial dances, a few involved offerings of food or tools, and many involved nothing at all. You simply made eye contact, shared a laugh, or mimed something anatomically optimistic, and waited to see if the other person walked away or closer. Jealousy, when it did erupt, rarely remained a private emotion. It became a public event. Whispered gossip, minor theft, slightly aggressive lice grooming. Sometimes the tribe intervened, sometimes they just watched with curiosity and a small betting pool of shell beads. Because while long-term bonding increased the chance of child survival, high conflict reduced the chance of everyone making it to spring. Some theories even suggest that early humans may have practiced group-level mating arrangements. Not orgies exactly, more like flexible rotational parenting, where children were considered communal assets and partnerships shifted seasonally or based on resource cycles. If winter was brutal, monogamy might be reinforced for stability. If food was abundant, people might spread their genes like joyful pollinators. This is not to say there was no concept of love. Attachment evolved in humans for a reason. Oxytocin released from mating and bonding behaviours created trust and closeness. You still missed someone when they were gone. You still felt something stir when they shared their best marrow with you. But it was less about forever and more about function. Less about vows and more about vibes. Romantic exclusivity as a cultural value came much later. Agricultural societies, with their need to pass down property and keep family lines clear, began to favour monogamy more rigidly. Before that, sex and partnership were shaped by terrain, climate, disease, and mammoth migration patterns. You adapted, you improvised, you tried not to cry when your favourite partner woke up next to someone else, and offered them the fat piece of roasted root instead of you. And the children watched it all, learned that relationships could be many things, that jealousy was real but not always rational, that love was complicated and often smelled like smoke and beetles, and that sometimes the best way to keep peace was to let go of the idea that anyone belonged to anyone else. Still, the drama never left. Humans are wired for tension, for preference, for longing. You can tell yourself it is just biology. That freedom of partnership made sense. But when your co-parent shares a sleep mat with someone who once fed you mouldy berries and laughed, something inside you still aches. That ache never went away. It just got dressed up later in poetry and wedding rings and laws. But here, in the cave, it was still wild, still tangled, still trying to understand how to love without owning and how to share without losing. And just when your heart has adjusted to this flexible prehistoric heartbreak, another surprise slithers into view. Because mating was not just about people. Sometimes it involved plants, roots, strange rituals, and the invention of the first very questionable prehistoric aphrodisiacs. You're chewing something. You're not entirely sure what it is. It tastes like bark that was soaked in sweat, and then stepped on by something confused and aggressive. But you were told it helps with what was not clear. All you know is that a hunched elder with too many necklaces insisted you eat it before approaching a potential mate, and now your tongue feels like it is trying to leave your body. Welcome to prehistoric aphrodisiacs, nature's original gamble, the earliest attempts at performance enhancement and romantic courage. Long before pharmaceuticals, before snake oil, and even before scrolls full of bad advice, there were roots, and rocks, and sometimes fermented substances that probably were not meant to be consumed at all. Sex in the Stone Age was messy, confusing, and occasionally humiliating. So of course people wanted to improve their chances. Early humans were observant. They noticed patterns. They watched which animals mated frequently. They noticed which plants made their bodies feel hot, or twitchy, or like their soul was slowly escaping through their left nostril. And then they drew conclusions that were sometimes brilliant, and more often deeply questionable. One of the most common prehistoric beliefs was that potency could be absorbed through contact or consumption. If a plant looked like a body part, it must influence that part. This is known as the doctrine of signatures. A root that vaguely resembled a phallus was assumed to enhance virility. A fruit that looked like breasts was assumed to increase fertility. No one ever stopped to ask whether these plants did anything useful. They simply handed them to the nearest person with romantic aspirations and waited to see if they vomited. Yohimba bark from West Africa, ginseng from East Asia, maca root from the Andes. These are later documented examples, but the logic behind them existed even in the Paleolithic. If it grew wild, tasted awful, and caused strange tingles, it was worth trying. The results were inconsistent. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it caused hallucinations. Sometimes it caused your organs to panic and your heart to briefly forget how to beat. Fermentation was another avenue of experimentation. Early humans discovered that rotting fruit could produce a mild buzz. Alcohol in its earliest form was not sipped from a goblet. It was scooped from the base of trees and possibly shared with a beetle. The inebriation was accidental at first, then it became ritualized. A little buzz took the edge off the anxiety of courtship. It also took the edge off balance, memory, and personal boundaries. But those were acceptable losses. Even minerals were not off the table. Ground up stones, shells, and strange crystals were consumed, worn, or placed near the body in the hopes of inspiring desire or performance. Certain types of ochre were smeared on the skin not just for decoration, but with the belief that colour could stimulate attraction. You were a walking cave painting, part art, part ritual, part hazard. And then there were animal parts, the horns of strong beasts, the testicles of fertile ones. If it reproduced impressively or violently, some part of it ended up in someone's mouth eventually. This practice continued well into recorded history. In China, tiger parts were believed to enhance virility. In Europe, powdered deer antler was consumed for strength. The logic was consistent. If an animal mated well, you should steal its magic by eating its elbow. Prehistoric aphrodisiacs were not just physical, they were spiritual. Certain herbs were burned to invite fertility spirits. Some groups conducted mating rituals during specific lunar phases, believing the moon governed passion and conception. Others performed dances or chants to awaken desire. If you did not get aroused naturally, you could at least try to frighten your libido into showing up with interpretive fire spinning. Of course, these efforts had side effects. Some herbs were toxic, some caused vomiting, sweating, hallucinations, or violent regret. There were no warning labels, only stories. You chewed a root, your pupils dilated, and the next thing you knew you were proposing to a large rock with confidence and excellent posture. But that did not stop anyone, because in a world where mating was necessary and awkward, anything that promised a shortcut was worth the risk. Even if the shortcut led to convulsions and your ancestors writing you off as spiritually cursed. Some plants genuinely had mild stimulant effects. Others influenced hormone levels or improved circulation. Whether early humans knew this is debatable. What is clear is that the placebo effect existed long before placebos were defined. If you believed a root made you more desirable, you stood straighter, spoke more confidently, sweated slightly less when making eye contact. That alone increased your chances. And then there was the social pressure. Elders had their favourites, secret blends, ritual powders. They passed these down with solemn warnings and ridiculous confidence. If it failed, it was your fault. You prepared it wrong. You did not chew it clockwise. You wore the wrong amulet. The root worked. You just failed to be worthy of it. Sometimes these rituals created bonding. You and your potential mate chewed the same bitter paste. You suffered together. You shared a hallucination. You screamed at a lizard that did not exist. And somehow, through shared discomfort and chemical confusion, you forged a connection. Whether it lasted beyond sunrise was another question entirely. Even children noticed these rituals. They learned early which plants were special, which ones adults whispered about, which ones required a special song before harvesting. These plants were protected, not because they were sacred, but because they were useful. Not medicinal, not nutritional, but romantically strategic. The prehistoric equivalent of a scented candle and a playlist. Over time, knowledge spread. Some plants became infamous, others disappeared. But the desire to enhance mating remained constant. It was not just about pleasure, it was about survival. A better mating experience might mean more successful bonding, more cooperation, more support during pregnancy and child rearing. Desire was a tool, a weapon, a currency. And so you kept chewing, despite the taste, despite the consequences. You chewed for confidence, for fertility, for a slim chance at not embarrassing yourself in front of someone who could snap a rabbit in half with their bare hands. Eventually the side effects wore off, the hallucinations faded, the aphrodisiac either worked or it didn't. But the tradition endured, generation after generation, each adding their own twist, their own ingredient, their own myth, until the original purpose was buried under layers of storytelling and moss. But the principle never changed. Sex was awkward, desire was mysterious, and humans would do almost anything to improve their odds, even if it meant chewing a root that made your nose bleed and your left eye see time sideways. You are leaning in. You think the moment might be right. The look was exchanged. The fermented root was chewed. The firelight is hitting your face at the exact angle where it hides most of the fungal rash on your jaw. But then it hits you. A smell. A wall of stench so thick it feels like you've walked into a physical object. Your nose recoils. your libido surrenders, and the moment dies faster than a squirrel in a lightning storm. Because even in the Paleolithic world, hygiene mattered. It might not have had a name, it might not have come with soap or water that did not contain something swimming in it, but it existed, and it could make or break a mating attempt faster than a sneeze during a sacred ceremony. Your cave was not a luxury dwelling. It was damp, it was dark, it was shared with others, most of whom had not so much as rinsed their hands in weeks. The air was a mixture of smoke, sweat, excrement, and animal grease. No one expected perfection, but there were limits defined by your nose. And if your scent reached someone before your intentions did, the answer was already no. Bodily odour was not just an inconvenience, it was a signal. Your scent carried information about your health, your stress levels, your diet, and your general ability to not be rotting from the inside out. A strong musk could signal strength and fertility. A sour one could signal disease or decay. Smelling good, by prehistoric standards, did not mean floral or fruity. It meant you didn't smell like something that should be buried. Cleaning yourself was possible, barely. Water sources were often frigid and occupied by animals who had no interest in sharing. Still, some effort was made. Early humans bathed when they could, not daily, not comfortably, but enough to rinse off the worst of the grime. Sand, ash, and rough leaves were used to scrub the skin. Mud was applied as both exfoliant and insect repellent. You were less polished spa treatment, and more desperate sandpaper massage. Hair was a separate problem. It was everywhere, on your head, on your body, in your food, sometimes in your eyes, tangled, matted, alive with visitors. Lice, fleas, and mites were constant companions. Grooming was both functional and romantic. A clean scalp was more than just a status symbol, it was a mating advantage. You might not be attractive, but if you were the only person within 5 square miles without visible bugs, your odds improved significantly. Teeth were a battlefield. There were no toothbrushes, no floss, no mints. You occasionally chewed on twigs to scrape off residue or freshen your breath. It worked. Kind of. Chewing sticks like miswak and other fibrous roots have been found in early archaeological sites. But the damage was done. Tooth decay was rampant. Gums bled. Breath was often described in historical texts as animal-like, though that assumes the animals had the courtesy to chew their food first. Clothing was part of the hygiene equation. Animal hides absorbed everything: sweat, smoke, grease, bodily fluids. Over time, these hides became aromatic in the worst possible way. They were occasionally scraped clean or aired out, but more often they were simply worn until they disintegrated or became sentient. Removing your outer layer did not reveal a cleaner person, it just changed the category of complaint. Despite the filth, standards existed. You knew when someone was going too far, when their odour no longer said fertile and strong, but diseased and slowly liquefying. Tribes learned to identify signs of infection. Smell was often the first clue: a festering wound, a rotting tooth, a fungal outbreak that had decided to expand its real estate. These smells marked a person as unsafe, not just romantically but biologically, and in a small group that meant risk for everyone. Romantic rejection in the Paleolithic often came with a sniff and a step back. No need for words, no dramatic explanations, just a quiet whiff and a retreat into the woods. If someone was repeatedly avoided, they might take the hint and wash, or leave, or die alone with their lice. That was the system. Crude but effective. There were surprisingly cosmetics, or what passed for them. Red ochre was smeared on cheeks, charcoal on eyes. Certain clays were applied to mask odour or protect from sun. These were not beauty routines. They were rituals, signals, displays of vitality and social awareness. You painted your face not to look better, but to smell less like a dead squirrel, and more like someone who could survive childbirth or fight off a hyena. Even perfumes existed in their earliest forms: burning herbs, rubbing leaves, carrying pungent roots in woven satchels. If you could not fix your body, you distracted from it, smoked yourself like jerky, and hoped no one noticed the infection beneath the rosemary sprig tied to your wrist. Cleanliness, such as it was, also played into fertility. A healthy mate was one who could keep parasites at bay, who had clear eyes and few sores, who didn't leave a visible trail of flakes behind them like a dry-skinned breadcrumb trail. Appearance mattered, not in the modern sense, but in the visceral, is this person going to die before winter sense? And if you managed to maintain basic hygiene, you were seen as someone with resources, someone with knowledge, someone who did not stink like doom. You became more desirable by virtue of smelling slightly less terrible than your competition. The bar was low, but it was consistent. Hygiene even played a role in childbirth and child-rearing. Clean hands meant fewer infections. Washed tools meant fewer deaths. A mother who knew how to clean a wound with boiling water and a rag soaked in herbal infusion was more likely to raise healthy offspring. That knowledge was passed down, slowly, through observation, through grunts, through moments of desperate experimentation when someone's foot started smelling like meat left too close to the fire. You did not need to be pristine. No one was, but you needed to manage the decay, delay the rot, smell just human enough to be approachable, and maybe rub some minty moss on your tongue if you plan to whisper anything remotely seductive into anyone's ear. The expectations were simple. Be clean enough to survive, be clean enough to mate, be clean enough that when someone leaned in close, their first thought was not to run into the nearest thorn bush just to escape your breath. And if you failed, you tried again, washed again, groomed again. Because even in a time when fire was a luxury and mammoths could fall from cliffs, humans still judged each other by their stench. You could be strong, you could be fertile, but if you smelled like infection and disappointment, no one was sharing their sleeping mat, and no amount of romantic beetle dances could save you. You're trying to flirt, or at least you think you are. You just offered a freshly roasted lizard leg to someone with symmetrical eyebrows and decent posture. They grunt. You grunt. There is eye contact, hope, maybe a spark, and then a noise, low, rumbling, too close. Everyone freezes. Because the moment you let your guard down for romance, the forest reminds you that you're still edible. This is love in the Stone Age. Less candlelit dinners and more frantically whispering, "Please do not eat us," while trying to maintain eye contact over a pile of twitching insects. You're surrounded by predators and parasites, and the constant anxiety that your next romantic gesture will be interrupted by something with claws. Everything in this world wants to eat you, or drink your blood, or lay eggs in your scalp. And yet somehow, amid the fleas and the fangs and the foot fungus, you're expected to find a mate, to woo, to bond, to create new life and raise it without being immediately devoured. It is less a love story, and more a prolonged exercise in risk management. Courtship happens between crises. You flirt during lulls in the chaos, between hunting and running and picking worms out of your feet. The moments are brief, but they matter. A smile shared while stripping bark, a gentle nudge while skinning a rabbit. Romance expressed not through poetry, but through practical acts. You fix someone's spear, you groom their lice, you swat a biting fly off their neck and they look at you like you just wrote them a song. But no moment is safe. That rustle in the grass might be a mating rival, or a snake, or a mating rival holding a snake. So you are always on edge, always scanning, always calculating whether you can survive the next 5 minutes long enough to finish a flirtatious gesture. Even sleeping is a group activity. Privacy is rare. You share your shelter with others, sometimes with multiple mating pairs, sometimes with relatives, sometimes with animals who have decided the warmth of your sleeping mat is worth the risk of being mistaken for dinner. You whisper sweet nothings while a boar breathes heavily in the corner and someone else has a night cough that sounds suspiciously fatal. Parasites are everywhere, in your hair, on your skin, inside your intestines. They do not care about romance, they care about warmth and moisture. You can tell someone likes you when they ignore the visible worms and still hand you the slightly less burnt piece of meat. That is love. That is sacrifice. That is acknowledging that your hair might be home to six-legged passengers, but your heart is still available. Sex itself is dangerous, not just emotionally, physically. You're vulnerable, distracted, exposed. Predators know this, so do other humans. Mating can be interrupted by territorial disputes, animal attacks, or just an enthusiastic toddler stepping directly on your ankle. And yet you persist, because reproduction is not optional. And somewhere in the chaos, the desire to connect still survives. Disease is a constant threat. Early humans did not understand bacteria, but they understood patterns. Someone mated with too many people too quickly, and suddenly half the camp had lesions. Coincidence was rarely accepted. Fingers were pointed, rituals were performed. Sometimes someone was quietly relocated to the outer ring of the camp, where the wind blew a little harder and the food arrived a little later. And then there were the injuries. Love bites were not metaphorical. People got scratched, bruised, occasionally dislocated. There were no soft surfaces, no safe words, no instructions, just trial, error, and the occasional emergency application of moss to the affected area. If you limped the next morning, it was either a success or a warning, or both. Yet romance persisted, not just for reproduction, for survival. Bonded pairs were more likely to share food, to help raise children, to defend each other. The emotional connection had biological value. It increased your chances of making it through winter, of recovering from illness, of not being eaten while sleeping because someone else was awake and holding a rock. Humans evolved for connection, for touch, for affection. You craved it even when the world made it nearly impossible. You looked for warmth in a cold cave, for comfort in a body that smelled like fermented onions. You whispered promises while gnawing on a bone and hoped that the person beside you would still be there in the morning and not off mating with someone who had fewer ticks. Even parasites influenced romance. A person free of visible infestations was more attractive, not because cleanliness was fashionable, because it signaled resilience, health, a body that could resist invasion. People sought out partners with the least symptoms: clear skin, bright eyes, a general lack of mysterious rashes. These traits were not just aesthetic, they were life-preserving. And if you did fall in love, however loosely defined, it was not eternal, not always. People died, moved, changed. The emotional bonds were real, but they were also adaptable. Humans had to keep going, had to find new mates, had to let go of the idea that any one relationship would last forever in a world where forever often meant until the next seasonal flood. Still, some bonds endured. Some pairs stayed together through pregnancies, through sickness, through the deaths of children and parents and neighbours. They grew together, learned each other's rhythms, developed unspoken languages of touch and glance. They fought, reconciled, shared dreams about bigger caves and quieter nights. They endured because love, in its most primal form, was not fragile. It was forged in fire and fleas and hunger. And when one partner died, the other mourned, quietly, loudly, with ritual, with withdrawal. They might not have had words for grief, but they had behaviours, withdrawn glances, delayed reactions. Loss marked the body before it reached the voice, and eventually the cycle resumed. Because it had to. Because the next predator would not wait for your heartbreak to heal. You kept trying, you kept loving, because even surrounded by danger, humans clung to connection. It was your one rebellion, your one comfort, your one reason to look past the constant threats and see something beautiful curled beside the fire, scratching at their armpit and smiling with a mouthful of questionable teeth. And just when you thought love was hard enough, someone in the tribe decided to introduce gods into it. Spirits, sacred unions, the idea that mating had consequences beyond the physical, that you might offend something watching from the stars. And suddenly romance had rules, and rituals, and guilt. You were just trying to mate. That was it. A little bonding, a little flesh-on-flesh awkwardness, maybe a stolen scrap of cooked marrow and some light eye contact under the stars. But now the sky's angry. The elder is muttering. Someone just drew a spiral in the dirt with a bone and stared at you like you personally offended the spirits of fertility by existing. And now you are part of a sacred problem. Because somewhere along the line, mating became more than biology. It became divine. Romantic partnerships were no longer just about reproduction or status or the absence of lice. They were now about appeasing invisible forces who apparently had strong opinions about who touched whom and in what position. You do not remember voting for this. But the shift was gradual. As early humans began to explain the unexplainable, reproduction was one of the first subjects to be wrapped in sacred cloth and handed over to unseen entities. A woman gets pregnant. Her belly swells. A new life forms inside her without any visible mechanical blueprint. That is magic, or spirit possession, or the direct intervention of a sky-based creature who likes to watch. The earliest fertility cults were not organized religions. They were fear-based systems built on pattern recognition and desperation. A good hunt followed a mating ritual. That must be connected. A child dies after someone mates without performing the correct chant. Clearly the gods are punishing you. Someone steps on a turtle during the new moon, and the entire village is suddenly infertile. Blame the mating spirits. It all made perfect sense if you squinted hard enough and had no access to scientific literacy. Symbols began to emerge. Carvings, totems, figurines with exaggerated sexual features. The so-called Venus figurines, found across Paleolithic Europe, are among the oldest known representations of the human form. Large hips, pronounced breasts, minimal faces. These were not art. They were prayers, offerings, icons of fertility meant to encourage safe births, successful mating, and maybe a mild blessing on your next attempt at foreplay near a swamp. Rituals became embedded in courtship. You did not just mate, you performed. You offered gifts to the ancestors. You laid stones in sacred patterns. You burned herbs that made your eyes water, and your libido question everything. You asked permission from something older than fire. You tried to guess what pleased it. And when nothing happened, you assumed you had failed the ritual, not the biology. Spiritual leaders emerged. They were not priests, not yet. But they were guides, interpreters of signs, listeners to winds. People who could tell you if the dream you had about a bleeding rabbit meant it was safe to conceive, or if your spirit animal was disgusted with you. They held the rules, the secret mating advice. They knew which direction to face during copulation to avoid angering the river gods, and which mushrooms to rub on your chest if you wanted to improve the strength of your offspring's bones. Some of it worked, some of it absolutely did not, but the system grew. Because people needed reasons. They needed stories, explanations, justifications for why some people conceived easily and others did not. Why some children thrived and others vanished before their first spring. The gods became woven into every thrust, every kiss, every missed period, and every misplaced animal pelt that was supposed to symbolize eternal love. Sex became something that could curse you. If you broke a taboo, if you mated with the wrong person, or at the wrong time, it was not just a mistake, it was an offense. Your crops might fail, your leg might snap during a hunt, Your baby might be born with an extra finger and a reputation, and the only way to fix it was ritual, confession. A night alone in the woods with nothing but a torch and a bag of pebbles shaped like shame. People began to believe that spirits watched them, not all the time, just during the interesting parts, and so mating became more discreet, more controlled. Certain locations were avoided, others were favoured. Sacred groves, fertility rocks, places where previous matings had allegedly gone well. You whispered to trees before undressing. You left offerings at cave mouths. You said a quick sorry to the stars before doing anything that might technically count as sinful thrusting. Spiritual mating rules often dictated who could mate with whom. Age, status, bloodlines. A pairing that broke tribal spiritual laws could be seen as dangerous. Not just socially awkward, literally dangerous. Forbidden unions were thought to attract bad luck, bad weather, bad births. And so matchmaking became political. The spirits were used as referees in social conflicts no one wanted to solve out loud. Even pregnancy was considered a spiritual event. The soul of the child was thought to enter the womb during certain phases of the moon, or while the mother slept near a sacred fire, or when a bird flew the right way across the sky during a mating. Some tribes believed the soul came from the father, others believed it came from the mother. A few believed it wandered in from the spirit world without asking permission. And if a child was born with a defect or died early, it was not seen as random. It was punishment, a broken ritual, a disrespected spirit. Someone somewhere had done something inappropriate with someone under the wrong constellation. Entire tribes would change their mating customs after a series of bad births. You were adapting, evolving, superstitiously, frantically, in the dark. You became afraid of your own body, its urges, its timing. You questioned your thoughts. Was that a lustful dream or a warning? Was your craving for that person across the fire a natural attraction or a test from the ancestors? The spiritual crisis was constant. You wanted to mate, but you also wanted to live. And now the two felt at odds. Of course, some used this system to their advantage. Spiritual leaders could manipulate rules to their benefit, declare certain pairings forbidden or sacred based on personal interest. If they liked someone, suddenly mating outside of rituals was an abomination. If they wanted to punish someone, they could blame their romantic failures on unseen gods. Religion had entered the bedroom, and it brought paranoia with it. And yet, humans kept going. You still mated, still bonded, still took the risk, because the gods might be watching. But the heart and the hormones were louder. You lit the fire, said the chant, rubbed the sacred leaf on your forehead and hoped it was not poisonous. You rolled the spiritual dice and made eye contact. Because the desire to connect, even under divine surveillance, was too strong to suppress. Eventually mating would become more codified. Institutions, rules, contracts. But here at the beginning, it was a chaotic tangle of instincts and incense, of biology and belief, of love that made you tremble not just from nerves but from the fear of cosmic retribution. And just as you begin to accept the new normal, something shifts again. The group is larger now, more people, more rules, more opinions, and now mating is not just spiritual, it is political, a tool, a transaction, something that can win you power or exile you to the cold side of the fire forever. You thought mating was personal, a matter of interest, instinct, maybe divine whim. But now someone with 2 bone necklaces and 3 fewer teeth than average is telling you who you are allowed to be attracted to. Apparently your romantic preferences are now a matter of public concern. Your hormones are being audited. This is what happens when survival becomes complicated. When the tribe grows past a dozen hungry faces huddled around a fire and becomes something more structured, more layered. Now your desire has a role to play in group cohesion, in resource distribution, in conflict avoidance. Sex is no longer private, it is tribal infrastructure. You do not get to mate with just anyone. There are alliances to maintain, status hierarchies to reinforce, powerful elders to appease, children to plan for, not necessarily in that order. Suddenly your body has been drafted into a negotiation you never signed up for. Your choices affect more than just your back muscles and your chance at affection. They affect the mood of the entire cave. Hunter-gatherer societies may have been more egalitarian than later civilizations, but that did not mean they were free from politics. Influence was real. Status was tracked. Who brought in the most food? Who led the best hunts? Who told stories that made people forget how hungry they were? These were not just traits, they were social currency, and mating was how it was spent. The best hunters often had more mates, not because they were charming, because they had mammoth steaks. Their protein-rich success fed others and ensured survival. So mating with them was not about romance, it was about calories. If you paired off with someone who could keep your stomach full, the tribe had fewer mouths to worry about. You were a good investment, but it went deeper. Pairings influenced power dynamics. If two high-status individuals bonded, their combined influence could challenge the existing balance. That made some unions dangerous, politically inconvenient. You might find yourself discouraged from mating with someone simply because your offspring would tip the tribe's unspoken scales. Mating was now succession planning. Group size mattered. In small bands, incest avoidance was key. There were unspoken rules about not mating within close bloodlines. Genetics were not understood, but inbreeding's consequences were obvious. Deformities, weakness, babies who could not survive a week. These outcomes led to cultural taboos, and those taboos became restrictions. The elders knew who was related to whom, and if you tried to flirt with your cousin, someone would throw a rock in your general direction before it got any further. In larger groups, the opposite happened. Strategic pairings were encouraged. Some lineages needed to merge, others needed to be kept separate. Your reproductive value was now a matter of community strategy. Your affections were weighed against the seasonal migration patterns of caribou, and whether the group downriver had recently lost a few fertile adults to an unfortunate avalanche. Mating could mend feuds. A union between rival family groups was a peace treaty, a way to tie bloodlines together and smooth over past insults involving stolen fish or disputed cave walls. You did not need to like each other, you just needed to reproduce and not stab each other during shared cooking duties. It was surprisingly effective. There were also punishments. Socially outcast individuals sometimes lost mating privileges if you hoarded food, if you refused to share, if you insulted the wrong person, or botched a sacred ritual. You could find yourself sleeping alone indefinitely. Romantic exile was real, not formal, but absolute. The tribe turned its back, and you learned the hard way that nothing is lonelier than a full moon and a total absence of eye contact. And then there were the arranged pairings. Not arranged in the modern sense, more like heavily nudged suggestions. You and someone else happened to keep being assigned the same foraging routes, the same night watch duties, the same tent space. It was not subtle, it didn't need to be. The tribe had decided you were compatible, or at least not mutually repellent. You would mate and like it, or pretend convincingly enough. Fertility became a political asset. A woman who birthed strong, healthy children had status, especially if those children survived past infancy. Her input carried more weight. Her mate received more respect. Childbearing success could shift a couple from ordinary to influential. Conversely, repeated miscarriages or child deaths could cause suspicion, whispers, accusations of spiritual contamination or cursed lineage. Politics disguised as concern. Jealousy, of course, was inevitable and dangerous, because a public feud between romantic rivals could fracture the group, could turn efficient cooperation into resentment and sabotage. so elders managed it, not always wisely, sometimes by separating individuals, sometimes by publicly shaming one party and hoping the other would back down, sometimes by pretending nothing was happening until someone got bitten during dinner. The tribe developed coping mechanisms, humour, ritualised competition, songs that allowed people to air their grievances without violence. You might wake up to hear a fellow tribesman singing about your romantic failures while pounding on a hollow log and laughing. It hurt. But it was better than open conflict. Emotional tension was managed like fire, contained, redirected, occasionally allowed to burn just a little to clear the brush. Gender roles added another layer. In some groups, women had more say in mate selection. In others, male dominance shaped the pairings. These dynamics varied wildly depending on ecology, group needs, and who had the loudest voice during full moon debates. But across cultures, one truth remained. Mating was never just about the two people involved. It was about everyone else who had to live with the outcome. Even children were affected. Offspring of high-status unions were often treated differently, given better food, better protection, better sleeping spots. They were groomed for leadership, or at least expected to fetch water with enthusiasm and not fall into the river. Meanwhile, offspring of taboo or disapproved pairings were sometimes ignored. Or worse, no one said it out loud, but they saw it in the distribution of resources, in the way elders spoke to them, in the way the tribe invested its time and attention. The politics were not always cruel. Sometimes they protected the vulnerable, prevented abuse, encouraged care. But they were always there, shaping who touched whom, who shared warmth, who was considered worthy of reproduction. You were being watched, assessed, strategized about. Your mating life was part of a larger game, and you learned to navigate it, to read the signals, to make alliances before affections, to weigh desire against consequence. Sometimes you loved someone you could not have. Sometimes you had someone you did not love. Sometimes you wondered if the whole mating thing was worth the effort when the cave ceiling kept dripping and someone had just eaten the last of the honey without asking. But you kept trying, because connection still mattered, because warmth still felt good, because even in a political jungle of unspoken rules and public judgment, you were still human. Still looking for something soft in a world built out of rocks and responsibility. And just when you thought you had the system figured out, the seasons changed. The food disappeared, the tribe migrated, and everything reset. New alliances, new tensions, new mating rituals involving elk hair and awkward chants you barely remembered. Survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant learning to flirt while pretending your cave neighbours were not ranking your desirability based on your recent firewood output. You have not felt your toes in 2 days. The firewood is damp, the food is scarce. Everyone in the cave smells like fermented disappointment, and the ash build-up under your nose now functions as a semi-permanent facial feature. Romance is not just dead. It has frozen mid-sentence and fallen over sideways. This is the winter mating season, less about passion and more about practicality. When the snow seals you in and the wind sounds like it wants revenge, even the ugliest, stinkiest, emotionally unavailable member of the tribe starts looking like a good idea. Survival changes standards. Attraction becomes strategic. And if someone can light a fire without crying, they're officially the hottest thing in a 15-mile radius. Seasonal mating was not just an emotional pattern, it was a biological one. Human fertility, though less seasonal than many mammals, is still affected by light, nutrition, and environmental stress. In times of scarcity, menstruation might stop, libido might drop, but not for everyone, and not entirely. Because humans, ever the defiant species, continued to seek comfort in touch, even when there was barely enough mammoth to go around. Winter mating served many purposes: emotional regulation, body heat conservation, political alliance maintenance, sometimes just the basic need to be touched by someone who was not trying to steal your food. Sex in winter was not about pleasure, it was about sanity. When the days are 3 hours long and the sun looks like it is losing the will to live, a warm body becomes more than a luxury. It becomes therapy. This is when you see strange pairings. People who would never glance at each other during summer now huddle together like they're writing poetry with their elbows. Standards relax, not because people are less picky, because frostbite is a persuasive matchmaker. No one wants to die alone in a corner while a more flexible couple takes the last warm rock. The politics relax too. Mating in winter becomes more communal, less competitive. There is an unspoken understanding that some boundaries blur when temperatures drop. No one questions the sudden coupling of that grouchy elder with the young basket weaver. No one mocks the awkward cuddling in the corner between two previously rival foragers. The rules bend, because the cold does not care about social ranking, and neither does the part of your body that now functions entirely as a heat radiator. Fire becomes central to courtship. Who controls it? Who feeds it? Who keeps it alive when everyone else is too tired to care? The one who stokes the flames earns quiet admiration. Maybe a shared blanket. Maybe something more. In winter, the ability to produce warmth becomes an aphrodisiac. If your kindling is dry and your stones are well placed, you're already halfway to mating success. But fire is also a risk. Too much smoke and you choke. Too little flame and you freeze. Starting a fire becomes an act of performance, a test. Can you provide? Can you protect? Can you flirt without accidentally setting someone's hair on fire again? The stakes are high, and the hair is dry, which means romantic mistakes often involve actual flames. Winter food also becomes part of the mating ritual. Sharing dried meat, a hidden cache of nuts. Even a scrap of honeycomb turns into a declaration of affection. You hand over calories like they are poetry. You offer a strip of smoked rabbit and wait for the spark. If it is accepted, you are in. If it is tossed back at your feet with a grunt, you retreat and pretend you were just testing for freshness. The emotional temperature also changes. People are touchier, moodier, prone to snapping at shadows. This is cabin fever at a tribal level, and mating helps. A release valve, a moment of distraction, but it also adds pressure. Misunderstandings fester, jealousies bubble. If someone shares warmth with another person, it becomes a source of passive-aggressive glances and suspicious firewood placement. Pregnancy during winter is both feared and valued. It signals fertility, hope, continuity. But it also means another mouth to feed, another body to keep warm. The tribe reacts with mixed emotions. Quiet joy, quiet panic. The mother is treated with reverence, but also with logistical dread. If she survives, if the baby survives, it will be a miracle. But miracles are exhausting. Children conceived during the desperation phase often carry stories, myths. They are born in spring, often too early, often too small, and if they make it, they are remembered as winter-born, tough, lucky, spirit-touched, or cursed, depending on how many people starve that season. Romance in winter creates consequences, and the consequences become legends. Even humour shifts. The jokes are darker, the teasing is sharper. Winter sarcasm is a tool, a weapon, a mating strategy. If you can make someone laugh while their nose hairs are freezing together, you earn their attention and their gratitude. Because nothing is sexier than momentary relief from existential dread. And then there are the solitary ones. The people who do not pair up, who sit quietly, who sleep alone, sometimes by choice, sometimes because their last partner was taken by illness, or walked into the snow one morning and never came back. The tribe watches them, checks on them, gives them more firewood than they need, because winter without love is survivable. but barely. When the snow finally begins to melt, the couplings change again. Some drift apart, quietly, without drama. Others stay. Unexpected bonds forged in frost, now solidified by habit and warmth. Some pretend it never happened. Some are pregnant. Some pretend they are not. The seasonal cycle resets. Rules tighten. Standards return. But for a moment, during the coldest months, everyone remembers what it means to hold someone not because of status or strategy or lust, but because the night is long and the world is cruel and your spine is shivering. You do not talk about it. You just move closer, share a hide, share breath, share something primal and fleeting and completely human. And then, as the cave thaws and the rivers run again, the flirting resumes with a new flavour. The desperation fades, but the memory lingers of what it meant to choose someone when choosing was not a game, when survival hung in the balance, when fire was not just warmth, but romance and salvation. You are crouched in a cave surrounded by strangers, reeking of smoke, sweat, and uncertainty. Someone just asked if you would like to join them in a fertility chant involving 3 sticks, a damp bare tooth, and some light rhythmic humming. You agree, you do not know why, but you are curious, and also bored, and slightly hungry, which historically speaking is how most ancient fetishes were born. You're now entering the realm of prehistoric kinks, not in the polished, velvet-lined, safe-worded modern sense, but in the deeply confused, experimentally primal, spiritually justified chaos of the human libido trying to figure itself out before agriculture was even invented. Sex had long since served its biological purpose, but humans, being the imaginative primates they are, could not stop there. They began adding meaning, style, variation. They began turning mating into ritual, and ritual into entertainment, and entertainment into something that made the elders cough loudly and walk away. Anthropologists have debated whether kinks existed in prehistory, but let us be honest, of course they did. Any species intelligent enough to make fire and avoid wolves for long periods is also intelligent enough to wonder what happens if you do it upside down with ceremonial paint on your elbows, while a shaman waves a burning leaf over your chest. Some of the earliest hints come from Paleolithic cave art. Alongside majestic animals and handprints are more curious carvings, exaggerated figures, symbols that might represent fertility, or excitement, or just really aggressive curiosity. Some show groups, some show hybrid figures, some show things that still make archaeologists avoid eye contact during lectures. These were not jokes. They were part of belief systems. The line between kink and ritual was thin, sometimes non-existent. You might tie someone up not for pleasure but to trap their fertility spirit inside them. You might spank someone with a stick covered in deer saliva to awaken their ancestral instincts. You might cover yourself in ash and roll down a hill while chanting, because the gods were watching and apparently had very specific tastes. Taboos became the breeding ground for experimentation. The more something was whispered about, the more it gained power and intrigue. Certain acts were reserved for sacred times, or sacred spaces, or just for when the other hunters were away and the fire was low and the elk hide curtain had been secured with extra urgency. Roles emerged, dominance, submission, not as identities, but as energies, archetypes, the hunter, the prey, the chieftain, the spirit vessel. You did not call it a kink. You called it a reenactment of cosmic struggle, or just Tuesday, depending on who you asked. Pain had its place, not always by choice, but eventually by design. Ritual scarification existed in many early cultures. Scars were marks of survival, strength, initiation, and for some, the sensation became meaningful, intimate, even transcendent. Pain as transformation, pain as proof, pain as connection to something bigger than yourself. Sound played a role, not just moaning, chanting, clicking, drumming, rhythms that mimicked mating, or storms, or the sound of hooves in heat. You participated not as a passive partner, but as an instrument. You became part of a symphony designed to summon something: fertility, power, pleasure, or just the approval of that one very intense elder who kept making you repeat the chant until your voice cracked. Even objects got involved: sacred sticks, phallic stones, hollowed gourds with suspicious instructions. You used tools because your imagination had outpaced your anatomy. Early sex toys were likely carved from wood, bone, or soft stone. Smooth, rounded, functional, sometimes decorated, sometimes worshipped, sometimes forgotten under a rock and rediscovered by an archaeologist who now questions all their career choices. Animals featured too, not like that. Calm down. But as symbols, totems, you wore feathers, fangs, skins. You took on the spirit of the beast, roared like a cave lion, slithered like a serpent, hopped like an unusually excited frog. This was not just play, it was transformation. Roleplay before the term existed. Cosplay in its most primal, bitey form. Consent was present, in its way. Primitive but real. A grunt for no, a grunt for yes, a slap to the hand, a sudden retreat. You learned boundaries by failing them, and the tribe reinforced them with glances, gossip, or exile. There were no safe words, but there was community, and while not perfect, it watched, adjusted, protected, sometimes poorly, but it tried. Kinks emerged as an extension of curiosity, of need, of boredom and boldness and too much fermented fruit juice. They were not indulgences, they were explorations. You were mapping your own inner universe with whatever tools and partners were available, and when something worked, it became sacred. When something really worked, it became tradition. Over time, some of these rituals hardened into law, others faded into taboo. The same act that once summoned the fertility gods was later banned for being improper. The cycle repeated, again and again. And through it all, the human need to play, to explore, to touch the edges of the map with wide eyes and trembling fingers. And here you are now, a modern creature in a soft bed or a creaky chair, listening to the echoes of ancestors who once rubbed honey on their knees and tried not to fall in love with someone wearing an antler hat. You carry their curiosity, their awkwardness, their deep, hilarious hunger for something more. So maybe, just maybe, the next time you feel a little weird, a little strange, a little too interested in something that makes other people raise an eyebrow, you can smile. Because someone 10,000 years ago probably tried it first, in a cave, with conviction, and maybe a goat watching. And that, dear sleeper, is how sex evolved from function to fascination, from necessity to ritual, from awkward grunts to whatever this was. So if you have enjoyed this absurd, factual, sweaty journey into prehistoric romance, consider giving a like, maybe a subscribe, or whisper our names softly into the smoke of your next campfire. Either way, thank you for spending the night in history's weirdest cave. Now close your eyes, let the mammoth skin blanket of sleep wrap around you, and if you dream about someone chanting over a beetle while wearing ceremonial moss pants, that is not our fault. That is your DNA remembering a good night.